So we're talking about fixtures now. Provision number 2, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Everybody good?
Good.
Okay.
Fixtures.
Kevin is going to tell us about fixtures. Good
As we all
job.
know, are things that go with the house that are attached permanently or installed later that cannot easily be removed.
Good.
In the offer of purchase, however, of course, there'll be items that the seller says they're taking with them. We, as the buyer, you would not see the listing agreement, but that's where the listing agent would come into play. Anything, as it states here, any item which is leased or not owned by the seller, such as fuel tanks, antennas, satellite dishes and receivers, appliances, alarm systems, security systems, must be identified here and shall not convey. Basically, I can use this for my example as well. When I bought my house, person on before had a surround sound entertainment system that was wired and everything throughout the entire house.
Mm-hmm.
I was told by my agent, of course, who was told by the listing agent, that this is not staying with the house.
The surround sound wasn't staying with the house.
So basically, it's in the offer of purchase to kind of cover both parties at this point. So the listing agent can't say, you know, we told you that you go to the house on the final walkthrough and all the entertainment system speakers that were inside of the walls and all been removed. You can't go to the closing and say, I'm not buying it because the entertainment system has been removed.
Right.
Well, we told you about this. Well, no, you didn't. I don't remember that.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the offer of purchase to kind of cover both rear ends of, you know, both parties.
Yeah, so he's saying if it's in writing and it's in the contract, you don't have a legal out or excuse by saying you didn't tell me though. It's all in the fine print here, so to speak. And so it was a fixture and it was meant to stay unless the seller accepted it out of the contract is what he's saying. Okay, good.
And then, of course, specified items, it's everything that would be figurative or typical that would be considered a fixture. You all can read that yourselves.
So remember that a fixture goes with the sale of the property automatically unless one of the parties says, but we don't want it to. And then there's a place to put that.
Correct. Other
Okay.
items that do not convey, that is where you would put the items that you are known that is not going with the house, that will be removed.
Right.
And even in my situation, of course, I didn't want, you know, holes in the walls up at the top corners. That was my stipulation that they had to get someone to professionally remove them because I didn't want speaker wires in my walls or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
They took blank covers and put over where in the top part, which actually works out because I have power up there if I remove it.
Oh.
But it is covered up, it's painted with the wall, and it's
Mhm.
noticeable, but it doesn't stop it.
Mm-hmm. That's neat. And that's a good thing that you added. You know, if you're taking it out, they're supposed to repair any damage, but you even added to it saying, okay, we get it, but we want to make sure that it's done correctly and it's not going to be
Yeah, that was a
seen.
disclosure for me. I wanted an itemized invoice from whatever company they had to do that. Cost them a little over $4,000.
Wow. To
I mean, it was
remove.
everywhere, yeah. This guy had speakers outside. He had like a master thing where he could control all the sound in all the bedrooms. It was in the bathrooms.
Mm-hmm.
To where if he's watching a football game and got something on the grill, he can flip a switch as he's walking by it. And go
Wow.
outside and he's hearing it on the back.
And he wanted to take all that? That's amazing for the money. It must have cost a whole lot more to put it in than that.
We were told that he had spent about 10 grand.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow.
The guy I bought my house from, he used to do all the entertainment and the sound and everything for Greensburg Grasshoppers.
Wow.
All the clubhouse boxes and all that.
Yeah.
He had a system where he put all that in and did all that, so.
That's really cool. That's neat.
It was nice.
Yeah.
It was with bows, had a subwoofer built in the bottom of the fireplace.
But you just didn't get it.
I didn't-
But it's a good example of negotiating and what you said in the contract though. That's excellent. Okay, go ahead.
But that's where that went in line D.
Good. Line D.
Personal property?
First.
Are y'all doing the personal property also?
Well, it was, I don't know, we stopped at personal property, but personal property is not only subject, I guess. Well, personal property shall be transferred to buyer at no value at closing. We use examples of things like firewood, a swing set in the backyard, things like that.
And so the examples, firewood on the back porch or in the backyard is movable and is personal property. And if somebody wants it, or if the seller says we're gonna leave it, it would go there. And other things, like you said, the swing set, if it's not in the ground in concrete, it would be personal property. Why does it say at no value?
Because the lender does not want to lend any money on personal property.
Good job. Did y'all hear that? At no value, the lender doesn't want this line item to have a lot of things in here where it looks like the price includes all of that. Where it looks like the parties up the price to include the personal property. The lender doesn't, they're saying we're lending on real estate. We don't want the impression that we're lending on personal property too. So generally speaking, there's not much there on the personal property line. If there needs to be a lot, you would get the seller's attorney to write a bill of sale and itemize everything if it gets to be a lot of things and have it separate from the contract. Good job.
Well, that's also there to, well, like that's the separate addendum for personal property bill of sale.
That's right.
But we use firewood just because it's the most simplest thing to use.
Mhm.
You know, if someone is buying a house that's 70 years old and doesn't want to move the firewood and they're getting gas logs installed, it's gonna be a nuisance for them to have it there.
That's right.
So as a seller stating that they're leaving it or taking it, that's just kind of letting, I guess, in public written notice that they're aware that what's staying and what's not.
That's right. That's exactly right. Good job. Where are you picking up now, ladies?
Not ours.
Not yours? Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, buyer's due diligence, number 4.
Okay, this on the buyer's expense that he's going to do with he's going to consult with his lender. And the loan process is being processed to make sure that all of these things have been gone over, and this will give him the chance, if it has not, he can dissolve the contract or
That's right.
not sign the contract.
Yeah, I like, I mean, that's a different word, dissolve the contract, which means the same thing as terminate it, doesn't it? So this is his opportunity to look at all those things. By the way, remind yourself, just like that note says in number 4, this is not a conditional contract. I remember when this contract was first introduced to the realtors, and we've had it for some years now, but when it was first introduced, it was really difficult to kind of understand how we have a contract that's not loan conditional. In other words, if the buyer can't get his loan, he needs to find out during that due diligence period so he can walk away. If not, and it's later after due diligence, he'll be in breach of contract. So that's what you mentioned the loan, Linda, so that's what that's meaning. It's not conditional, but it's a good thing to get all that done. Okay?
So you want to go through them all?
Give me the most important ones. Did you pick out any that you felt like would be, they're all important, I'm not trying to say that. But did you find any that you felt like we ought to bring to our attention?
Review the document.
All the documents,
Inspections,
inspections,
Appraisal.
appraisal,
survey.
I mean, we can go that for
All
another
of them
hour.
are important. That's excellent. If I were you, I'd pay attention to reviewing the documents and the home inspection, of course. What about the streets and the roads? That was the lecture you had in, Unit 6, wasn't it? And what'd you say?
If it's private or public.
Private or public. Why is that important to the buyer, if the roads are private or
Who's
public?
keeping it up? Whose responsibility is it?
Who's keeping it
Maintaining.
up?
Maintaining.
Who's maintaining the roads? Because if they're private, the homeowners will. If they're public but not staying maintained, the owners will. So that's a real important thing that a buyer would want to know. And like you said, Linda, some of that would be in the documents if it's a restrictive neighborhood, with restrictive covenants. It would be in there if the roads were private, and talk about that. Okay?
Yeah, see?
We're good.
All right, so C talks about negotiations or repairs that the buyer and seller agree on. If they don't agree on anything, the property's been sold as is in a restrained condition. And if they do agree on some type of repair or negotiation, it has to be a separate addition to its contract. It must be in writing and signed by both parties.
I love what Demaria said. Did y'all catch it? He said the property's gonna be sold as is unless the buyer does inspections and unless he asks the seller to make repairs and then negotiate it. I don't know if it even said as is. It says in its current condition. But guys, remember, was it in Unit 7 maybe or 8? Did it talk about North Carolina being a caveat emptor state? And that means let the buyer beware. So buyer beware, it's up to you if you want to do these inspections. If not, you're buying it as it is. Okay, good. Excellent, I like it that you said that.
And D is talking about buyer's obligation to repair damage, pretty much saying the buyer is obligated to pay for damages that the buyer or the agent or happened while they were at the property, unless it was by a North Carolina licensed inspector or any other licensed professional. That's saying that the buyer is not responsible for that,
Now, say that again.
right?
Say that one more time.
So it's saying that the buyer should probably pay anything. Okay, so if there was a buyer's agent or contractors, where in the property at the time of inspection or the time of the due diligence period, that they are responsible for the expenses if there's any damage, unless it's damage caused by a North Carolina home inspector, licensure board, or any other licensed professional.
Okay, here's what we need to say about that. If the inspector is doing a regular inspection job and something, let's say he falls through the ceiling because the wood's rotten in the attic or something and he just falls through, that wouldn't be the buyer's fault because of the inspector just doing his regular inspection, no fault of the buyer or the inspector. He fell through because the wood was rotten up there. And so it would be the seller's responsibility then. Does that make sense? If he's undoing a screw for a light switch, which I don't know that they do that, if he's undoing and he's got his screwdriver and he's undoing and the screwdriver just goes into the wall because it's rotten, that would be up to the seller too. So it really sounds like it's more like if the inspector makes a mistake or is negligent or something, the buyer is responsible for the actions of that inspector. Does that make sense? Does it make sense?
No.
No? If a buyer hires an inspector to do an inspection and the inspector messes up, let me give you an example. We sold a house, an old house years ago, and we did have a basement, and there was a sump pump in the basement. And the sump pump is to drain water out of the basement. It's there for a reason. And there was a switch that had to stay on, I guess, or in the proper position for that sump pump to work. We sold the house and the buyer had inspections, and the inspector went in the basement and didn't put the switch back where it needed to go. And of course Murphy's Law happened. We had a big rainstorm and the basement flooded. And so that's a mistake of the inspector, not the buyer's fault. Does that make sense?
But they're only liable for however much you pay them, right?
It was like,
I beg your pardon, I said that wrong. The buyer's gonna be liable for that. I beg your pardon, the buyer will be liable for that because he hired that inspector and it was no fault of the homeowner. Thank you for correcting me, that's exactly right. What'd you say?
Same thing.
Yeah, it
But
would
if it goes
be,
back to the inspector, they're only liable for how much you paid them.
yeah, the inspector, I called the inspector myself and here's what he said, I didn't do that, is what he said. Now, how do you prove it? And, left a really bad taste in my mouth about that. But anyway, so do you understand now? If you hire somebody and they mess up, you're responsible for them, is what I mean. If they mess up because the house had a rotten floor, it's not the inspector's fault or your fault, it's the homeowner's fault. Okay, go ahead now.
All right. E, what I think this pretty much saying is, that you're not gonna hold the seller responsible for any, injury or damage or claims, as a result of agents or contractors, working or inside the house or property.
That's right.
And buyer's right to terminate is saying that the buyer has the right to terminate for any reason or no reason, as long as they have written notice of termination. And then if the buyer does terminate, they shall get their earnest deposit money back.
So if they terminate during the due diligence time frame where they are allowed to, they will get their earnest money deposit back. And what about the due diligence fee?
No.
No. It's the cost of having the right to do the due diligence and the time for it. Okay, good.
And the warning's just saying that, the seller is not obligated to grant an extension, however, the seller can, if they both agree upon it.
Mhm.
That's pretty much sums that up, I think.
Okay.
Buyer representation.
So, sorry, we'll read this one. Closing shall constitute acceptance of the property in its existing condition. Basically what you were stating earlier about if you don't do all this stuff for what it is, it's gonna be sold as is.
That's right.
So loan, self-explanatory pretty much, but just to break it down Barney style. If you're obtaining a loan, whether it's FHA, VA, venture or other, it's gonna be stated here and specified. Yeah, pretty much, so if someone tries to hike up the rate on you, you have legal documentation that it's supposed to be at this rate, this fine, this loan, like conventional, 30 years.
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, let me ask you this. I want you guys to think about this. We know this is not a loan condition contract. So why is the buyer filling in information about his loan? And why does it matter to the seller, is what I want you to think about. It's not loan conditioned, so why are we filling in information about the buyer's loan? And why does it matter to the seller?
It gives them a kind of heads up to kind of see like, okay, well, this guy, well, I've had a bad experience with FHA, so this guy's getting a VA loan, so he's gonna be automatically approved. It's gonna be a done deal if we go with this guy, or maybe offers.
You said that well. It gives the seller a head up. I'll take your answer in a minute. It gives the seller information to decide if they want to take this offer based on what the buyer's telling them he's going to do.
But there are different conditions for a VA loan
Mm-hmm.
and things that the house has to
It
have.
has to appraise for the value.
Well, not only that, but you also, railings have to be certain heights and
Yeah.
all different types of accesses.
Yeah, so what Elizabeth is saying is, if the buyer puts in here, they're gonna get an FHA or a VA loan, the seller might say, what does that mean to me? Ask you, their agent, and you need to have some knowledge about it. FHA appraisers are stricter, VA appraisers are stricter. And there may be some things, if there are repairs to be made, or some things that need to be changed, like the railing height, well, those appraisers are gonna make sure that it's done, and it'll fall on the seller, or the buyer won't buy the property. So there is something that comes with it, and I like what Hunter said, it gives the sellers heads up so they can really decide, am I gonna take this offer? Someone today said, what if we were talking about it today and you put in the interest rate that the buyer is looking out for their loan? what if the buyer put in there 3%? Guys, interest rates are not 3% anymore. I mean, they're up in the mid to upper fours now, aren't they? So that should give you a little, a red flag. Where are you getting 3%? I just need to know if I want to take this offer based on what you're telling me. It's not a condition, but this is information that will help the seller decide if they want to take the offer. Does that make sense? Where are you getting 3%? I just want all the information so I can make a decision on whether I want to take this offer.
Well,
So
not,
does it-
not only that too, but like Hunter said, if someone has just a personal preference or a bad experience with one, and there's multiple offers coming in, they
Excellent.
can go through their multiple offers and make a better educated decision for themselves.
Is everybody, did you hear
Or if
that
it's a cash
too?
offer.
Could be a cash offer and then this FHA offer, and so it gives them information. That's what, when it says buyer representation, here's the information that the buyer is giving the seller so the seller can decide if they want the offer. So everyone, they need to be honest here too, don't they? Or we could say that's misrepresentation if they don't, if they're not honest here. Very
So is
good, very good.
Is it required that it has to be filled out?
All blanks need to be filled in. Now,
Can we put NA? That's what I'm
yes,
saying.
you can put NA, but if the buyer has to get a loan, it would be a good idea, it needs to be disclosed.
Just basically you get fax out a pre-approval letter, just something like that.
Most sellers want to, what I'm hearing now because of what Kevin said, with multiple offers, if you've got multiple offers, you probably do want to see pre-approval letters or pre-qualified letters so you can decide which one do I want to take. A lot of sellers are asking for that now. You know, if I'm considering this offer, I want to know, have they been to the bank yet? Tell me where they are. Okay, go ahead.
So other property, what I basically understood from that is that well, my impression of it, which may be wrong, probably is that the buyer, if the seller has to, or if a buyer has to sell their house before they can buy this house.
That's what that means, exactly right. They don't have to attach the addendum, but it's highly recommended. Hunter said this section on other property, buyer wants to go ahead and make an offer on the seller's property, but they have another house to sell. Don't you think that would be information the seller would want to know one way or the other? And the buyer can make it contingent by attaching the addendum, or they can just not attach the addendum and not have it a condition. They can still terminate during the due diligence period, right? Whether the addendum is attached or not. Okay?
And then the performance of a buyer's financial obligations is basically stating that the buyer is agreeing that they will be able to financially meet their obligations. Like they don't have like this random debt of $30,000 they're not disclosing so that they can qualify for this house. But if they disclose it, they wouldn't be able to get the house.
That's right. Good job. So remember, didn't we have a quiz question that said, if the buyer has a poor credit rating, do you have to tell the seller? And the answer is yes, because they need all the information to decide if they want this offer. And it doesn't mean they won't take the offer, they just need the information so they can decide. Okay, go ahead.
You got the Residential Property and Owners Association disclosure statement. You check whether, yes, they did receive the signed copy of the North Carolina Residential Property Owners Association disclosure statement, or no, they did not. And then it goes on to say, whichever of the following events occurs first, the end of the third calendar day following receipt of the disclosure statement, or number 2, the end of the third calendar day following the effective date. Or number 3, settlement of occupancy by buyer in the case of a sale or exchange.
So what does all that mean?
If they haven't received it, they can withdraw.
Yeah.
If what?
If they haven't received it, right?
That's right.
They can withdraw.
They can withdraw, and that's explaining when can they. When can they? And so they can rescind if the buyer doesn't get this residential property disclosure statement, the homeowners association disclosure statement, they've got 3 days to rescind, depending on if they didn't get it before the offer, or if they ever do get it, it will start the 3 days clock. Why is it important that the buyers see that?
So question,
If during that 3 days they do decide not to do it, right, that, the tide money, the first one, not the earnest money, but the other one,
The due diligence fee?
do they get that back?
Oh, good question. Good question. Let me see here. Good question.
It does.
I would say, does it say? I don't
It
think
says
so.
including a refund of any.
It says without penalty, including a refund of the due diligence fee. Excellent point. There's a fine print, isn't it? So, that's a good reason, right there. The due diligence fee, seller, you can't keep it if the buyer didn't get their property disclosure and they decide to walk away. So getting back to why does the buyer need to see this property disclosure?
Because it tells you a lot of information about the property,
Tells you information about the property, like what, for example?
this is the one like where it says like the gas, you check yes, no representation.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what else on it.
How old is the roof? How old is the house? Is there electrical problems, plumbing, and that sort of thing? So, what were you saying? You can check no, or you can check,
No representation.
what does no representation mean?
You're not saying either yes or no.
Seller's not saying either yes or no. We're gonna check NR, which stands for no representation. And so what would be the benefit to the seller for saying no representation?
Wouldn't be held against them.
It's not held against them, because if they would have checked yes, there's some, probably more like this. If they would have said, no, there's no problem, and then a problem does show up, they're gonna be liable for that. Because you could argue that they're misrepresenting by answering the wrong way. So when they choose no representation, they're not held accountable. And you know, no representation they could be saying, we just don't know, and we don't want to take a chance saying yes or no. Okay, very good. Good, and good question there, Elizabeth, about that money, because I had overlooked that. All right, carry on.
And then E was the mineral and oil and gas rights mandatory disclosure statement. And again, it has the same 3 days follow-up if you do not get your signed copy.
That's right. And this is important. Why is this important? This mineral and oil and gas rights.
Well, it's kind of like the example that you gave before. I think it was you that gave it. Where they had sold the property and they went under and was mining or
Yeah, the fracking.
fracking.
Mm-hmm. And because it could upset, remember when we learned in day one about subsurface rights and the integrity of the lot? If somebody's coming in and fracking underneath, that could cause trouble. It says it's a mandatory disclosure. I don't know if you remember reading about this. It's not a real estate commission mandatory disclosure. It's a North Carolina law. And when they came up with this law some years back, they did task the real estate commission with coming up with the form. So the commission did develop the form, but it's a North Carolina law that we have all sellers, with a few exceptions, answer these questions so we can give it to the buyer. Okay then.
That was it.
That was it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Page 6, buyer obligations. This section talks about the fees and expenses the buyer is obligated to pay. The first one we've already touched on a little bit, responsibility to propose special assessment. The key here is proposed. They would be responsible in the future if that were to occur.
Good.
And the responsibility for certain costs, it goes through a little bit the list here. Of course, they're responsible for their loan, costs associated to any type of lender fees, and declarations made to the lender. Also charges that are required by maybe an owner's association for future use of enjoyment, like maybe a homeowners association. They would be responsible for those. Let's see, membership fees and charges for their use of those. I wasn't quite sure about 3, determining restricted covenant compliance, what type of fee they would have there.
Determining restrictive covenant compliance.
Because restricted covenants would already be in place, would they not?
Yeah.
So I didn't know
I'm gonna have to look that up for you.
Maybe like an HOA's enforcement actions, like fines? Would that be something similar to that?
Oh, that could be it. What, determining responsibility, if the buyer wants to look into, how does the, association,
Or the fees, how they work, or
Mhm.
whatever.
and how do they enforce the owner's,
If there's
compliance?
insurance,
Is that what you're saying, Hunter?
Basically.
Yeah, how does that work?
Could you, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but could you use the fountain story like that in that kind of same category, I guess?
Use what?
Okay.
If someone built the fountain in their front yard by
Mhm.
HOA policy and procedure, you're not supposed to. They
Mhm.
sell that house, the buyer buys it, 6 months later, they're loving their fountain, and then
Mhm.
HOA comes to them and says, hey, you gotta take this down.
I think that's a perfect example. Did y'all hear what he said? Buyer buys it and something wasn't in compliance, and now you're gonna come and tell us. I think that's a very perfect example, really. You know, and so that wouldn't the buyer wanna know? Because if they read over the restrictive covenants, they would know something's amiss, and then how's that gonna affect me later? Is that what you're saying, Kevin? I think that's perfect. I like it. Thank you very much.
Other things, of course, they're responsible to pay for any appraisal that they ask for or require, title searches, title insurance, and actually the recording of the deed, all in preparation for the closing, and all of the preparation and recording of the instruments for the closing to secure that. Authorization to disclose information basically says it's okay, and they're authorizing the bank and the real estate agent and the closing attorney to share all this information amongst the parties at closing, whether real estate agent, buyer, seller, attorney.
Good. Very good. That was, that's a pretty fairly new addition. When the Dodd-Frank was signed in 2015, closings began to change. The buyers would have their closing separate from the seller having their closing, and each other wouldn't see the closing documents. And the agents, is unknown, or the agents privy to this information. But it really is, we're still in agency, and we're still working on the contract until it's finished. And so this was fairly recently added, where we need to see them. We need to see and look at these disclosures so we can look out for our seller or our buyer. By the way, when we talk about closing in Unit 21, the commission says whatever form you do see, you need to check the numbers. So you may only see your seller side. If that's all you see, that's what you're responsible for, double checking the closing cost numbers and the prorations and that sort of thing. If you see both sides, you need to look over both parties' closing numbers. Whether you represent one or the other, you're supposed to look over whatever it is you see.
I had an example where I purchased a home and the attorney's office on the seller side, they were gonna help me with closing costs.
Right?
I got the wrong number, so I ended up having to take a personal check for additional monies to pay that the seller back, because they didn't put enough there. So I had to take another amount of money.
You've had some
You
high
had
God.
So with me, yeah.
You should have took this class.
Lord have mercy.
But it's just an example of, there was a mistake.
Yeah.
And it was the day before closing, and there was no time where we were gonna have to move the closing dates.
Yeah, and time's money, and closing it on time is, it reminds me, and this might be sort of what you were saying, when a buyer and seller are negotiating closing costs, in the contract, there is a line that someone's gonna talk about. How much, is the buyer asking the seller to pay closing costs? So we need to fill in a dollar amount or a percentage of the sales price, but it needs to be fairly finite. And so if it said the buyer wants the seller to pay $2,500 of closing cost, and you get to the closing and you see a debit from the seller's money of $2,500 and a credit to the buyer's side for $2,500, and you check the closing cost and add them up, and it's $2,300, there's a mistake. Because the seller's not giving the buyer a credit for all that money. They agreed to pay closing costs up to that amount. Does that make sense? I had a student in my class, buyer, who said they were counting on that extra money. And see, that's kind of like sellers just saying, here's some money. And that's not the intent of that. So we'll pay up to this amount, and that's a good thing that agents need to check. Make sure that it didn't go over. Make sure the seller, if they're the ones paying it, are charged the right number on that. Okay, good examples. All right, go ahead.
7 is seller representation, which has to do with the, it's pretty much the property disclosure form, which they would provide ownership, assessments, any homeowner obligations which are needed to satisfy the buyer's financial guidelines. They would provide the lead-based pamphlet, and I guess the buyer can get an inspection of the property if they want it.
Oh, for lead paint?
Yes.
You could, yeah, for sure.
The sellers to provide the buyer with title information, access to the warranty deed, negotiate seller concessions, and pay confirmed assessments. And buyer breaches must refund all fees and all earnest money. Due diligence fees and all earnest money.
Okay, I want to ask you a question. On number 7, seller representation. Why do you think they're asking, seller, have you owned this property at least a year or less than a year, or you don't own it yet? What could that be?
Make sure they're not trying to like run from something, kind of.
You know what, I know what Hunter's got, he's got that in mind because of his, what he does, but exactly right, it was about loan fraud. Were you just guessing?
No, I mean,
Okay.
a year is like, just like a relationship or anything you do significant in your life. What is a year? You really haven't invested anything in a year.
Yeah. And so it came about when buyers were buying properties and turning them over, just like that. There was a lot of loan fraud, everybody, back when we were in the financial crisis. And it was put in the contract for that reason, maybe just a signal to the lender, what's going on here. The other thing that comes to my mind is capital gains tax. We're going to talk about that in Unit 19. If you've owned a property longer than 12 months, you'll pay the long-term rate. If it's 12 months or less, you're going to pay the short-term rate. And that all has to be, what is it? What are you asking?
Does not yet own the property.
That would be if someone has an option on a property, and a lot of investors do this. They find a property that maybe is a really good deal, put an option on it, which means hold that property, and then they go find a buyer that they can sell the option to and make a little profit there without even
Investing.
Mhm. So they're kind of selling their option or their rights to it to another purchaser. I've heard people say, well, they bought this property and found somebody that'll pay $10,000, or they're under contract with this property, and they found somebody that'll pay $10,000 more, and it's just one smooth deal, and the person that really didn't officially buy it made $10,000 off the deal. So that's what not yet owned means. But the capital gains taxes, when every closing, the lawyer sends in to the IRS, usually in February, what they call a 1099 form, and they're showing what the seller's proceeds are and the seller's social security number and that sort of thing after every closing. So some of this has to do with loan fraud, and I suspect some of it has to do with that too, the 1099 that the lawyer sends in. Okay?
That was pretty much for this section. The other stuff would be like declaration of restricted covenants, rules and regulations, any bylaws that runs with it, or guidelines for construction, parking restrictions, and so forth.
So this section is the seller's giving information to the buyer, so a buyer can make the proper decision on whether to stay in or not. And so all of that is important to the buyer for their decision making if they're going to stay in the contract or not. Okay, number 8, seller's obligations.
So for the evidence, the title payoff statement, that ensures that the seller pays off all the debt to the property and delivers copies of the title insurance
seller should include the status of any liens they have against the property. For authorization to disclose the information, I was confused on that one, but I guess that one's saying,
Where are you? Oh, the authorization to disclose.
I guess that one's saying that they need to disclose anything that may prevent, or anything that may have like a cloud, title cloud.
Mhm. And they're gonna disclose that any kind of title insurance information they have. One thing about that, if the owner of the property purchased title insurance when they bought the property, and now they're selling this property, the attorney would like to know what company do you have for your title insurance? Because they can contact that title insurance company and look at the policy and maybe even get a reissue rate for the buyer, which is a little bit of a discounted rate if they're using the same title insurance company. So it's just giving all the information to the attorney on behalf of the buyer.
And for access to property, in the walkthrough inspection, the seller must allow the buyer to do a final walkthrough and also have access to any of the utilities that are in the house, like electricity or gas or water.
And so if the buyer is going to be doing a walkthrough inspection, then that means, seller, you shouldn't disconnect or have your water turned off or have your power turned off. It needs to stay on so that they can do this inspection. I wanted to ask you though, it says the first part of that letter C says, seller shall provide reasonable access to the property. So what do you think that means, reasonable access?
Like if they want to show it, and like bring people to show it.
Well, this is already a contract now, so in this, it's saying that they're given reasonable access to the buyer, and so, I guess I'm asking, what do you think reasonable means?
They're not limiting, like, so you can only have your inspection guy come between 6 and 9 PM. So like, they have reasonable time, like throughout the business day, they can come by,
Yeah,
as long as they approve it.
yeah, and reasonable, I just keep thinking about if a buyer said, well, we want to come today, and we want to come tomorrow, and we want to come, and it's kind of like, let's get this together, because somebody's still living here, let's make it reasonable. But I do think that's open to interpretation, what's reasonable to one person or another, but the agent should kind of keep that in check. You know, if a buyer wants to do multiple inspections, let's see if we can coordinate that where it's done in the same day maybe, or close to the same time. Okay? Who's talking? Okay?
The removal of seller's property, which means bringing the house to, look reasonable for the next person moves in, removing all personal property and garbage, and get it ready.
You know what? It's a shame we'd have to write that in, remove the debris and the garbage, but you'll hear and probably see things that people just leave and don't take. And, that's bad. I don't know that I'm going to say that's a breach, but you said you were going to remove it, right? Lots of times it falls on the agent. Buyer moves in and they see what the seller's left. They call their agent, and then their agent calls the listing agent, and you get up with the seller and say, you know what, we need to get this out of here, and somebody's going to have to pay to have it removed. I've heard people say, we just finished a broker course, a post-license course, and one of the agents said that the seller said, oh, well, they can just keep what they want. And it's kind of like, I don't want to go through your stuff and keep what I want. I want you to take all your stuff, right? They should. Okay, what about the next one?
E has to do with the seller furnishing an affidavit or agreement stating that no one can claim a lien against the property.
And so what does that remind you of, that we talked about maybe in Unit 3?
The liens have been satisfied, the labor or whatever, there's no outstanding debt before you sell the house.
And Hunter, I heard you say laborer. Guys, this is about a mechanic lien. In other words, when we go to closings, sellers are gonna sign this lien affidavit. The lawyer, it says in the verbiage, and the lawyer's asking them, have you had any work done in the most recent 120 days that have not been paid for yet? Remind yourself, if a laborer, a contractor, a subcontractor has not been paid, and they come back later to file a lien after closing, it's a specific lien on the property, isn't it? And it also enjoys some priority. Do you remember that? They get in lien order based on the first date they were there to do the job. So it'd be important, sellers sign this affidavit. Have you had any work done that's not paid for yet? And if you have, you're gonna sign that you're gonna be taking care of it and paying for that bill. Okay, what else?
Yeah, I guess that kind of ties in E, just the seller giving the information out for their lien agent and, giving documents about the liens being paid off before settlement or by settlement.
Yeah, that was the section, you're exactly right, it goes with E prior, and it's about if any work is being done that's over $30,000, then the contractor should have a lien agent just to report to, have it filed in within 15 days of starting the job so that that can all be handled, let's just say maybe a little bit more smoothly. Okay?
So then we go to G, which is good title and legal access, and this was talking about, that it's going to deliver a general warranty deed,
Right?
and that it's, so it's a marketable deed. It says, convey a fee simple, unmarketable, and insurable title, and again, going back into the free from loans, mechanic loans, other liens, or liens, encumbrances, etc.
Free from liens that we don't know about, because there is a little except there, isn't it? Except for these things, or except for these encumbrances, okay?
There is a note that the buyer, if the buyers fail to terminate the contract prior to the due diligence period, it doesn't, what did I say here? It doesn't negate the lien responsibility.
Of the seller.
Yeah.
So if the buyer doesn't terminate based on the information they have, it doesn't change this, this general warranty deed and the obligations of the seller. And if they can't adhere to it, then we could argue the seller would be in breach, okay?
There's also a note on short sale that you should attach the 2A14T form. Then we go into deeds, taxes, and fees, where the seller has to prepare the deed and all the other documents required, including the excise tax.
Good.
We've got I, which is the agreement to pay the buyer's expense, and I had a big huge question mark on that one. But I guess in a buyer's market, you'd be more willing to pay for buyer's expenses.
That's a good point. Elizabeth said, under this section where the buyer's asking the seller to pay part of their closing costs, if it is a buyer's market where the buyer can choose from many things and you want them to buy your property, you might be more inclined to pay part of their closing costs. Although, I would almost guarantee, even in a seller's market, if a buyer is using FHA financing, which is typically for first-time buyers, or using VA financing, there's probably going to be something here, even in a seller's market, where the buyer is asking the seller to pay some closing costs. Now, if there is, the price of the property might not be negotiated. In other words, the seller might say, if I'm paying this for your closing costs, I want this sales price. I don't want to come down there too, because then it's money out of my pocket on both ends. Is everybody with me on that? You're making a good point, depending on what the market's doing, because if it's a seller's market, they're in more control, and they can say, no, we're not paying any.
Paying no point on your mortgage.
That's right, that's right.
All right, so then, owners,
I have J. So
Okay,
owners
great.
association fees and charges, so here in this case, the seller has to pay any fees that are on their account that they're outstanding or have to be prorated for the time that they would still be in the home.
Right,
They would be responsible for those.
right,
And any other fees imposed by the owners association. That's not covered, and it refers us back to 6B, because there could be some potential buyer obligation related to that. So anything the buyer is not responsible for, they'll have to pay. And then finally, fees incurred by the seller in completing the residential property owner's disclosure statement, and anything other certificates, information that they have to provide related to the sale.
okay, good.
And then, are for, payment of home firm special assessments. So, if it's known, it's yours.
We've talked about that a
Yes,
lot,
we-
haven't we?
Yeah, so-
That's really interesting, it's in the contract a lot, but it's reminding the seller here though, isn't it?
Yeah, if it's confirmed, then it's the seller's obligation. Late listing penalties, all property tax late listing penalties, if any, shall be paid by the seller. What's that?
Every year in January, we get a listing of personal property notice, and you're supposed to, if you've done anything to your property, notice listing, if you've added on to your property or done anything since last year, you're supposed to note it and send it back to the tax department. And, you know, it's kind of a way of keeping up for tax bases. If you haven't done anything, I don't even believe you have to send it back in. I can't remember on that.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about now.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah,
Haven't done anything.
you don't have to send it
Not
back
now,
in.
we used to, you had to put none or NI
I
or
know,
zero.
and send it back.
And then negotiated repairs and improvements, so if you've agreed to do, the improvements, then you need to do them.
Mhm. In a workmanlike manner.
Yes, and they need to be done well.
Right.
And you need to allow the walkthrough, which you've kind of already talked about as well. And then, seller's failure to comply or breach, then, again, we kind of talked about it, if there's a dispute over who gets the earnest money,
Mhm.
the losing party pays the attorney fees.
Good. Okay, excellent, everybody. Let's do this. I'm gonna pick up on the rest of the contract and give you some highlights, but I want you to take your next break, because it looks like it's gonna be our last break for tonight. So go ahead and take your next break, and then, and actually, let's make it a quick one if you don't mind. It's 9:26. Let's just take about 7 or 8 minutes and get back, just make it a stretch break, and we'll come back and finish up a few things.